All right, but we have a stipulation with, signed by,
Yes, and I can read that.
all right, and is this a stipulation as to what testimony would be, or a stipulation of fact?
It's a stipulation of fact, namely the fact being the authenticity of the photo of the histologic slide.
Okay, we can do that. Okay.
This is fine.
Yep. But
Okay.
we're not gonna read the whole thing.
No.
Kate will do it.
I'll do it and I'll just read the note.
Ms. McDougall, is this your last witness? Okay. And do required findings, and then do you have witnesses today, Ms. Reed?
No, we don't. And just for the record, while we're waiting, I believe there's going to be a stipulation as to the defendant's date of birth before I arrest.
Okay.
And then technically I think the view is part of my case, but obviously I'm not going to wait till rest after the view, but I don't know if the court wants to address that at all. So those would be the only sort of outstanding items.
All right. I don't think there's any need to address the view. I think that's a...
I don't either, I just sort of want to.
No, I appreciate that. Ms. Regan, there's no need to address that. That's something that's requested by both sides, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. And what time's the release Wednesday? Is it noon?
11:15 to have the school clear by noon.
Jury, all right. Court is now in session. You may be seated.
Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to discuss the case among yourselves with anybody else during the recess? None of the jurors answered affirmatively. If we could have the witness resume the stand, please. Yes, please, Ms. McDougall.
If we could have the projector on. Dr. McDonald, with respect to the injuries that you labeled E through P, I think you indicated that none of those injuries cut through a major structure, just through muscle and tissue. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would those injuries, however, have caused pain?
Yes.
And you had also indicated there were 3 injuries on the right side of Ms. Ritzer's neck, which you labeled A, B, and C. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And are those depicted on the diagram that you have indicated?
Yes.
Okay. And can you describe for us injury A and what you noted about it and what you noted about its path?
So injury A and injury C are both stab wounds of the neck. So again, it's shorter on the skin surface than it is deep. So both of those stab wounds went through the skin, soft tissue, through one of the big neck muscles, and then both of them injured the right internal jugular vein, one of the big veins that drains blood out of the head.
And the internal jugular vein, what effect would that have of that being injured?
Well, if you breach the surface or the wall of the vein, obviously you would have blood loss.
With respect to the internal jugular vein, where would that blood loss, what would you expect that blood loss? Let me ask you this, is that particular vein one which is under pressure?
Well, all of the vasculature is under some level of pressure, yes.
And in terms of compared to other veins, would you expect, let me ask you this, what is arterial spray? or arterial bleeding?
Sure. So arterial bleeding and venous bleeding imply bleeding from either an artery or a vein. So blood that's leaving the heart goes away in arteries. Arteries go away from the heart, and that is blood under a higher pressure system than blood that's returning to the heart. It's a relatively low pressure system. So if you breach the wall of a vein, it's considered a slower bleed than if you breach the wall of an artery, which tends to, you think about the movies, it essentially gushes blood. So that, in reference to your question, I apologize, it is the bleeding from an artery or the spraying from an arterial source that's what's labeled as arterial spray by folks who do blood stain analysis.
And in fact, this vein, the internal jugular that was damaged by cuts A and C, that is not, that is a vessel that is going back towards the heart, therefore a slower bleed because the blood is going back towards the heart.
That is correct.
Okay. And would you expect the bleeding to be initially internal or external to the body?
So that question depends on how the body is laying.
Okay.
Initially, obviously, the vein is inside the neck, so the first bleeding would be inside the neck, and then, depending on the body's position, would be able to exit the neck as well.
Okay. With respect, and let me ask you this in terms of the consequences of damage to the internal jugular vein, what are the consequences to Ms. Ritzer? What happens to her body when that vein is damaged?
So it's in effect exsanguination or extreme blood loss. That in and of itself is a lethal injury.
And
I said that in and of itself would be a lethal injury.
And with respect to injury B or wound B, can you describe for us, as you did, that what observations you made of that injury?
So B is somewhat similar to A and C. B, however, is coated in green, so that's an incised wound, meaning, again, it's longer on the skin surface than it is deep. It had a similar wound track to A and C. Again, it goes through the skin, the soft tissue, then goes through one of the big neck muscles, and again, damages the wall of the internal jugular vein on her right.
So all three of those injuries damaged ultimately the same vein. Is that
That is
fair to say?
correct. Mm-hmm.
Now, on your diagram, there is an injury D that is depicted almost like a V. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then did you do a separate diagram of that injury in the middle of the diagram?
I did.
Can you describe for us injury D?
So D is a V-shaped defect that has, as you can see on the right-hand sketch that I drew, has these irregular edges that appear. D appears to be the confluence of multiple incised wounds that in a conglomerate generate this V-shaped defect, D.
So while you call it one wound, you believe it required multiple stabbings, is that correct?
Multiple incisions based on the wound edges being irregular and having this shape, yes.
Okay. And can you describe for us what damage you observed to Ms. Ritzer's body through wound D?
So wound D, as you can see in this image, involves the right side of her neck, it crosses the midline, and then involves the left side of her neck. So some of the blood vessels on the left were damaged. The left external jugular vein, so a smaller vein than the one I just talked about, which was the right internal jugular vein. This is a smaller vein, as well as the left carotid artery. So that's an artery which is a little bit deeper inside the neck. In addition to those two blood vessels and the skin, soft tissue, and muscle, other structures were damaged. So this wound D cuts across the thyroid gland, which sits on top of essentially your Adam's apple in your neck. The wound track proceeds then to go through her trachea from front to back. And behind the trachea, or windpipe, is your esophagus, or the tube going from your mouth to your stomach. That is also injured. And ultimately, the wound track, or the conglomerate wound tracks, I should say, they stop at the vertebra C6, so they eventually stop after hitting the backbone of one of the vertebrae.
And did you in fact see evidence on that vertebra of the knife made, or the blade made contact with the vertebra?
It did. The blade penetrated, but not perforated the vertebra.
And I think you already testified that the trachea is cartilage. It's somewhat tougher than skin and tissue. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what about the esophagus? What is the consistency of cutting through the esophagus?
It would be more like cutting through muscle.
Okay. So the injury that is labeled D essentially goes, at least at one point, all the way back to the back of her neck to the vertebra. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you indicated that the carotid artery is different than both the internal and external jugular vein, which were damaged, because can you describe how that would be different in terms of severing or damaging the carotid artery?
Sure. So we've talked a little bit about the pressures in arteries versus veins. So arteries have a higher pressure system. If you then breach the surface or injure the surface of your artery, blood will come out with more force than bleeding from the veins. So the carotid artery would have produced more rapid bleeding or exsanguination than a venous injury would have.
Do you have any way, Dr. McDonald, of determining the chronology of injuries to Ms. Ritzer?
No.
And would that include the asphyxiation, meaning you can't say what came first?
Correct.
Showing you a photograph, Dr. McDonald, do you recognize what that photograph depicts?
I do.
And what does that photograph depict?
This photograph depicts primarily the left side of the decedent's face, neck, and upper chest.
And does that photograph depict those portions of the neck injuries that you've described for the jury?
It best depicts the injuries on the left side of her neck, so E through P, with some proportion or some visualization of D.
And are you able in that photograph at all to see any of the petechiae that you described for us?
Because we're kind of looking at this side of her face, it's more challenging. There appear to be one or two up by her jawline, but it's not the best representation.
Okay. I would ask this be marked as the next exhibit.
Admitted.
Exhibit 134. And showing you another photograph. Dr. McDonald, do you recognize what that photograph depicts?
I do.
What does that photograph depict?
This photograph depicts an anterior view of her, essentially up under her neck, the decedent's neck and upper chest, allowing visualization of the remainder of the injuries.
And in particular, does that photograph depict the most of wound D?
Yes, it does.
I would ask this be marked as the next exhibit.
Admitted.
Exhibit 135. Dr. McDonald, in addition to the injuries you've described already, did you have cause to examine the genital area of Ms. Ritzer?
Yes, that's routine as part of an autopsy examination.
And initially, did you do an external examination or a visual examination of the genital area?
Yes.
What, if any, observations did you make?
So there was an approximately 1 by 3/4 inch laceration or a skin tear at the vaginal introitus, which is essentially the opening of the vagina.
And can you just assist us in understanding, fair to say the term vagina is used rather loosely as opposed to how you would use it anatomically?
Sure.
Anatomically, what do you consider the vagina?
So the vagina is essentially the canal sort of between the labia minora, disappear up into the vagina. That would be the introitus. And then the vagina is then that canal before there is the cervix and then the uterus.
So when you talk about the vagina, fair to say you're talking about an internal structure?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And what were you able, I think you've said this, but you were able to visually see that injury externally, is that fair to say?
Yes, you could.
Did you do anything to do further examination of that injury?
I did. So I took a portion of tissue from that area for histologic examination. So that piece of tissue is then prepared in the form of a slide so that one could look at it under the microscope.
And did you, in fact, conduct a further examination of that portion of vaginal tissue under the microscope?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you observe of significance to you?
So what I saw was the mucosa or the surface of the vagina, and then beneath the surface or the submucosa, beneath the mucosa, is this connective tissue, and I saw some hemorrhage within that connective tissue.
And what's the significance to you of seeing the hemorrhage in the tissue?
The significance is that there's intact red blood cells, again, within the soft connective tissue. It essentially provides evidence for what I already knew looking at the genitalia on external examination, that this injury was sustained around the time of death, either a little before, a little after, or during the dying process.
How did you characterize it in terms of, how did you characterize the timing of the injury to the vagina?
So it is considered a perimortem injury, which peri, P-E-I-R, mortem, that's a fancy term essentially for, I can't tell if it happened right before death, right after death, or during the dying process, but it happened somewhere in that interval.
And what is the, what are specifically are the findings that lead you to conclude perimortem?
Sure. So the presence of the intact red blood cells in the tissue, some folks would surmise that the heart still had to be beating to get the blood cells into the tissue, and that would be considered an antemortem piece of evidence, I guess. This area of forensic pathology is fraught with differences in interpretation. Folks in the community, in the forensic community at least, recognize that this is a challenge, and the presence of the red blood cells means essentially that the person didn't die that long before or after the injury. It happened right at the time, but I don't see evidence of it being a remote injury.
If this injury had occurred when she was not injured in any other way, alive and well, and this injury occurred, what would you have expected to see?
An abundance of hemorrhage in the area.
And if this injury had occurred clearly post-mortem, her heart had stopped beating for some significant period of time, what would you have expected to see?
Sure. So by textbooks, you would expect to see no blood at all. Let's say we were 24 hours after death or something like that. So the blood had stopped beating from the heart a long time ago. You're kind of gathering the complexity in this issue, because you could also argue that whatever implement or whatever caused the laceration or the tissue tear could have pushed the red blood cells around after death as well. So you cannot clearly distinguish that this was a postmortem wound caused by an implement well after death, or if her heart was still beating, and hence where I'm essentially vacillating, because it's impossible to know.
And that's why you term it a perimortem injury.
Correct, yes.
In addition to the examination you conducted of the injury, did you do evidence collection from the vaginal area of Ms. Ritzer?
Yes, this is part of the examination before any internal examination is conducted.
And did you in fact complete an evidence collection kit in this case?
I did.
Specifically with respect to the vaginal swab, from where did you take the vaginal swab?
So as part of the kit protocol, the vaginal swab are actually swabs that are inserted into the vagina. So again, that internal structure that we talked about, versus the external genitalia swabs, which are conducted on the outside of the genitalia.
And with respect to the anorectal swab, from where do you take that?
So those swabs as well are inserted into the rectal area for collection.
And do you what do you do with all of the swabs?
We box them up very meticulously in a box similar to that and send it to the state lab.
And in fact, you recognize that particular evidence collection kit?
Yes, I do.
And what do you recognize that to be?
The kit from decedent Colleen Ritzer.
And does that kit contain signatures and as well as a kit number?
It does.
And what is the kit number?
The kit number is 46405.
I'd ask this to be marked as the next exhibit.
No objection.
136. Doctor, other than the injuries you've already described, the abrasion on the chin, the contusions on the chest and belly and elbow, the sharp force injuries to the neck, and the evidence of asphyxia, did you make any other significant findings with respect to your examination and autopsy of Colleen Ritzer?
No, I did not.
And in fact, other than those injuries, did she appear to be a healthy female of the reported age of 24?
Yes, she did.
Doctor, as the conclusion of your autopsy, as well as the other examinations you did you reach a reasonable opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of her death?
I did.
What was that opinion?
So her cause of death was sharp force injuries of the neck and asphyxia by strangulation.
And why the hybrid conclusion?
Sure. So asphyxia by strangulation as well as the sharp force injuries are both lethal in their own right and separately. I couldn't be certain, again, we talked about the sequence with which injuries occur. I couldn't be certain whether the asphyxia occurred and then the decedent lived through that episode. Therefore, I combined them as essentially a hybrid cause of death.
But although the asphyxia ultimately would be lethal, she could have lived through that episode and still been alive if the sharp force injuries were inflicted afterwards.
That is correct.
And fair to say you are presuming that the asphyxia came first because of the damage to the neck and the difficulty in inflicting asphyxia on the neck in its condition?
One could draw that conclusion about chronology, yes.
But you have no medical information that gives you an understanding of the chronology of these
That is correct.
injuries, is that correct? And with respect to the lethal injuries, do you have any medical information to tell you whether they happened all at once or whether they happened over a period of time?
That's not something that an autopsy can answer. Only on TV would they essentially do that for you.
Okay, thank you. If I could just have one moment, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. So, you can't tell if she was killed by the asphyxia or by the stab wounds, right?
That is correct. A combination of both lethal injuries are present.
And you don't know whether she was asphyxiated but survived and revived and was then stabbed,
That's a
Correct.
possibility, correct?
or whether this knife attack was post-mortem.
Whether what, I'm sorry?
Whether the knife attack was after she was asphyxiated and killed.
Correct.
But the evidence you have of the asphyxia is the petechiae, correct?
That is correct.
All right, and one thing you do know is that she didn't get those petechiae after she was stabbed, after she was cut.
That is one interpretation.
Well, correct me if I'm
Sorry.
wrong, the petechiae are a result of little capillaries sort of bursting because of the pressure in the head, correct?
Correct, that's true.
And the pressure in the head builds up because there's blood flowing up through the carotid artery,
Yep,
and the blood coming down through the jugulars is cut off, so it can't escape, and the pressure builds in the head, correct?
correct.
And that's how you get petechiae.
That is true.
All right, and she has a lot of petechiae.
She does.
All right, enough to indicate that she could have been asphyxiated to death. Could have been.
Yes, could have been.
Once the jugular is severed, that pressure is released, correct?
Presuming there's no pressure being applied to the neck simultaneously, correct?
And by the way, you say that this little group of injuries on the left side,
E through P,
the two stab wounds and the one
that would be on the right side of her neck.
on the right side of her neck. You say that each one of those penetrated the one of her jugular veins, correct?
So two of them actually perforated the jugular vein,
Yeah.
and then one penetrated. So penetrated means you enter the jugular, but you don't go through the wall on the other side. So yes, there were three separate and distinct injuries to that jugular
So
vein.
the one that perforates actually severed that vein. Is that correct?
It poked, or it essentially poked a hole from front to back, yes.
So So that would go a long way to release the pressure building up from blood building up in the head, correct?
Yes, it would allow for exsanguination.
All right. And then you said that that large sort of confluence of incise injuries,
Wound D.
wound D, actually severed her right carotid artery, correct?
Her left carotid
Her
artery.
left carotid artery. And right and left is from the point of view of the body of the person, not looking at it.
Correct, yes,
Okay.
that's why it's confusing.
And a jugular on that side.
An external jugular, so a smaller vein, yes.
Okay. So those two vessels are actually severed, is that correct?
Let me refer to my notes
Yes,
just to be
please.
sure. I believe they're both perforated or severed, as you said. That is correct, yes. So they are both perforated.
So not only is the pressure relieved by basically unblocking the egress,
Correct,
but in fact, one of the two sources of ingress of blood to the head is also cut off by the carotid being severed.
so exsanguination is occurring via all three vessels, yes.
Okay. And I think you also mentioned that the damage to the jugular vein would itself be lethal.
Are you referencing the right internal jugular vein?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
Breaching any large vessel would obviously result in
So all by
exsanguination.
itself, that could have been a fatal injury.
Correct.
How long would it take for the person to bleed out and die with just that one injury?
From injury to, again, to the right internal jugular
Yeah.
vein? Greater than minutes.
How many minutes?
I cannot say with a
Give
reasonable
us
degree of
a
medical
ballpark
certainty.
figure.
Sustained, but you can inquire whether or not the doctor's able to indicate a time frame within a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
All right, so the judge puts a question. Can you indicate any time frame, how long it would take for death to follow that injury?
So again, I'm going to stand by the answer of minutes. We're not in seconds, but we're not in hours. So we're somewhere
Okay.
10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, somewhere in the ballpark of minutes.
All right. How about 40 minutes?
It is a possibility.
All right. A far out possibility.
Correct, a far out possibility, but a possibility.
All right. In the ordinary course, what would you expect to see?
I'll sustain the objection in that form, but as to the level of possibility at 40 minutes, I'll allow errors of inquiry. I'll sustain the objection as asked.
All right. So then looking at the injuries on the left side in that large injury D, the left external jugular, was that perforated or was that?
It was perforated, yes, front
So
to
that's
back.
severed. Okay.
Severed.
And the left carotid.
Correct.
Was severed, correct? And either one of those injuries all by itself could be fatal.
That is true.
And I'll ask you the same question about the severance of the external jugular and left carotid. How long would it take for the person to bleed out and die?
We're in the same ballpark of minutes.
And the pressure going up in the carotid is greater, correct, than the pressure coming down in the jugular,
That is correct.
right? And in fact, the carotid is getting blood more or less directly from the heart. It goes from the aorta to the carotid, correct?
Correct.
All right. How many liters per minute gets pumped out of the heart?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Fair amount of what gets pumped out of the heart goes directly to the head, correct?
A portion of it does, correct.
So would you expect the severance of all three of those vessels to result in nearly immediate death? All three of them?
Yes, they are all a lethal injury leading to exsanguination.
Right, and with all three of them being severed, the exsanguination, the bleeding out, is going to take place faster, correct?
That is true,
Because
yes.
it's going to be bleeding from three vessels, including one
You're
of
losing
which
more
is the
blood more
carotid. It's
rapidly.
coming directly from the heart.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry. We crossed over each other there. Go ahead, why don't you go back, please, Ms. Dawson? We
All right,
crossed over the question and the answer.
So the severance of all three of those vessels would accelerate the death,
That is true. You would exsanguinate more quickly.
right? More quickly than you would with just one of them.
True, we've damaged 3 vessels instead of 1.
And how much bleeding would you expect to see from those injuries?
Within the body tissue or in the scene?
How much would you expect to see bleeding out? Would you expect to see a lot of blood from an injury like that?
Yes. Quantifying, I'm not able to do.
All right. But the person would be bleeding profusely.
3 vessels being severed, yes, I would agree.
And with 3 vessels being severed, fair to say the bleeding out process would go roughly 3 times as fast?
Having not done any computational analysis, I'm not sure.
So all you're sure of is it certainly would go faster than just 1 vessel,
Yes.
but whether it would be in direct proportion to the number of severed vessels, you're not sure.
Whether it would be tripled or essentially divided by 3 is not something that I know.
Okay. But it would be significantly faster.
It would be more quickly.
Okay. And not only would the person die, but they would also lose consciousness early in that process, correct?
That is true as part of the dying process. If blood is coming out of the brain at some point, there's not enough oxygen and you do lose consciousness.
So they'd lose consciousness even faster than they would die.
It's my understanding that you lose consciousness before you die, yes,
Okay.
in the process of exsanguination.
Okay. So then the bleeding, once the heart stops, does the bleeding stop?
Which bleeding are you referencing?
When the bleeding out from the 3 severed vessels in the neck, when that results in the heart stopping, when the person dies, then the bleeding stops, correct?
So when you remove essentially the engine of the body or the heart from creating a pressure-based system, all the pressure equalizes, so there is no blood moving in your vessels. But that is not necessarily what you see as bleeding at a scene when bodies are moved around, et cetera.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So even though the heart stops, there's still blood in the body.
Yes, correct.
It doesn't pump out 100% of the blood before death.
That is true.
Right? And the blood that's in the body, there might be some more bleeding from moving the body.
Correct.
From applying pressure to the body.
Yes, I suppose anything that would generate pressure or allow blood to escape.
For
a
example,
wound.
laying on top of the body.
Yes,
Okay, that would push some more blood out.
yes.
Now, I think you said you determined that the asphyxia was caused by strangulation, correct?
Correct.
And that the evidence you had of that was the petechiae.
Correct.
petechiae would be consistent with asphyxia by compression also, am I correct?
That is true, correct.
So someone sitting or kneeling on the torso or chest of the person could asphyxiate them.
That is correct. You
Right.
get petechiae in a slightly different distribution, but they are in fact present in chest compression as well, as you indicated.
And the petechiae might have a little broader distribution if it was a compression asphyxiation, correct?
Correct.
They wouldn't just be limited up around the eyes.
Correct. Petechiae, if the chest is compressed, they involve from that point of compression upward, so you see petechiae in the upper chest, on the neck, and up into the head.
And you looked for signs of strangulation, correct?
Always, yes.
All right. You looked for ligature marks?
Yes,
Didn't find any.
correct,
No, those would be external marks that you would see around the neck area, correct?
correct.
You looked to see if there was any hemorrhage in the neck muscles that wasn't accounted for by the cutting.
Which was not possible due to the sharp
Because
force
of the cutting,
injuries.
so you just don't know.
You can't tell,
All
correct,
right. And you looked to see whether there was any fracture of the hyoid bone,
correct,
and there wasn't.
correct.
You did note some contusions, I think, on the chest and abdominal area.
Yes,
Might those be consistent with someone kneeling or sitting on the chest?
that is one possibility. All I know is that a blunt object made some sort of impact with above her left breast and on her right abdomen.
So the strangulation in this case, and certainly if there was a strangulation by compression, there would be petechiae, as we just said.
As we
right?
said,
So the evidence you had was pretty much equally consistent with compression or strangulation,
So the evidence against compression was the distribution of the petechiae?
not broad enough?
Correct.
That's kind of a fuzzy criteria. There's not a hard line in that.
That's true.
Okay, kind of a judgment call.
It is.
All right. Certainly the petechiae in this case weren't concentrated all up around the person's eyes.
So the petechiae involved her whole face,
Yeah.
around her eyes, and in her mouth.
And in her mouth. Mm-hmm. Okay. You identified the clothing items that the victim had
I did.
when she was brought into the autopsy. I want you to just take a look at this photograph. Oh, yeah, folks, look at this.
You may.
Just have a look at that.
Yes, sir.
You recognize what that is?
I do.
Could you just tell the jury what it is?
So this is a photograph of the evidence that's being displayed as far as her clothing and personal effects. So I see that purple shirt that we reviewed, the white tank top, and that tan colored bra.
And those are items that were photographed at the medical examiner's office at the autopsy.
After they were removed, yes.
Is that a fair and accurate representation of those items as they appeared that night?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to move to admit this.
Admitted.
About 137?
So looking first at that purple shirt, fair to say that the blood all seems to be, mostly, the great majority of the blood seems to be concentrated in the back of it rather than the front.
So I'm interpreting that reddish-brown stain that we're seeing up there as
Correct.
blood, and did so at the autopsy. And yes, most of the reddish-brown staining appears posterior or on the back of her torso, part of her shirt, and her arms.
Okay. And same thing for that undershirt.
Same.
The blood is all run down the back of it.
The blood appears to be on the back of the shirt,
Just a
correct?
few splotches and drips on the front. Correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So almost all the blood is soaked into the back of those two garments.
Correct, that's my assessment as well.
And certainly when when an individual suffers the kind of laceration, confluence of lacerations that you described in
The incised wounds of
that
D?
incised wound, that D-shaped thing, there's a lot of bleeding that would come right out of the body, correct?
Yes.
It wouldn't be sort of internal, and you'd be waiting a long while to see when it was going to come out. It would bleed right away.
That depends on the position of the body at the time those wounds were inflicted.
But there's a lot, those wounds sever an artery that has a lot of pressure in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Has more so than the vein.
And a jugular vein, which is not
Insignificant,
non-existent.
correct.
Okay. So would you say that the fact that the blood from this injury is all back around the victim's back, is that consistent with a picture in which the victim is lying on the ground when she's attacked with a knife?
So that is one interpretation. It's fraught with, and I say interpretation because the distribution of blood would depend on again, as I said, the position of the decedent at the time the wounds were inflicted. I don't know whether that blood got there after the body was moved or if that blood initially was there as part of, while the heart was still beating, as part of the injury.
Well, let's put it this way. If she was standing up when she sustained that injury D, right, you'd see blood on the front of her, wouldn't you?
Correct, but if she was laying anteriorly, you wouldn't necessarily.
When you say anteriorly, you mean
If you were laying on,
her
she was
back?
laying on her stomach. So I'm not sure, I can't tell whether she sustained the injuries, whether she's anterior and bleeding this way, or whether she's posterior and bleeding down her shirt. That's not, that's
So
subject to interpretation.
Every incise wound, or every stab wound at least, that you identified was on the front of her neck and it's front
Correct.
to back, correct?
Yes,
All right. And so that would be consistent with her either standing up or lying on her back.
that is consistent with the implement going from anterior to posterior or front to back. The position of the decedent is not something I'm able to tell by autopsy.
All right. So you're not confident that no, but you think she might have been lying on her stomach when these wounds were?
Sustained based on the last answer.
And the injuries that you identified on her neck, they're all concentrated on the neck, under the chin, correct? Sort of
That is true.
Between the chin and the collarbone, correct? And the three on the right side, A, B, and C, they're maybe a half an inch apart, correct? Within a small area.
They're within a small area.
And
This is not, however, drawn to scale.
Correct.
I'd have to reference my numbers.
but you also, in your report, you locate them by
Yes.
reference to the distance, to the distance down from the top of the head, correct?
Correct.
As well as the distance from the midline. All right. And it's fair to say that A and C are, in fact, within a half an inch of each other from the distance from the head.
That is correct.
And all three of them are at the same angle. They're all horizontal, correct?
So A and C are both horizontal.
Yeah. And so is B, correct?
Excuse me while I look at my notes. That is correct. Those all three are horizontally oriented.
So you've got these three knife wounds that are concentrated in a small area and that they're parallel, correct?
They're all horizontal, correct, yes.
Right. Okay. And then that larger cluster of knife wounds on the left side, they're pretty closely clustered together also, not as closely as the right side.
The neck being a small structure overall, it does appear they're tightly clustered, yes.
Yeah,
They're
very
all on the
close-
front of the
they're
neck
very
on the
close
left
together,
side.
And except for those ones on the far right, they're also parallel.
They're all at different angles if we think back to the photo that was displayed to the jury. So some are horizontally seen and some are oblique, meaning they're kind of at an angle. So they are not all parallel by definition.
Well, you would agree that E, F, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, and P are all oblique, rising to the right, oblique with the anterior part at the right, correct?
You'll have to repeat the letters. I have to reference my
Yeah,
notes to know the
here we go.
exact angle of the wounding.
E. F,
Yes.
H, I. Am I going too fast?
Nope.
Okay, J,
Just referencing different parts of my chart. Yes.
K, L, M, N, O, and P.
They are all obliquely oriented, yes.
Okay.
Meaning
And
they're at an
close-
angle.
They're close together and they're roughly parallel. Would that be fair to say, roughly parallel?
Roughly, they're all at an angle.
All right. So this is consistent with an attack on a victim who's not moving, at least in relation to the assailant.
After
Correct?
that, hold on, you'll have to put that into a form of whether or not she's able to indicate that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, or you can frame it as not inconsistent with.
So if the victim in this case was immobile, was not moving, for whatever reason, and the individual inflicted these wounds all at once, sort of a frenzied attack, right? These closely clustered, basically lined up parallel injuries would be consistent with that scenario, that the individual, that the victim is not moving.
That is one possibility, yes.
Okay, it would be consistent,
It's not inconsistent with that.
not inconsistent. Okay, good. And if the victim was lying on her back, well, let me put it this way. If the blood was all going to the back of the victim in her clothing, that would not be inconsistent with the victim lying on her back when she was not moving. and being
Correct, that
steady,
is one
correct?
interpretation, yes.
And the asphyxiation that you're talking about in the petechiae, that asphyxiation could have resulted in her being, well, one, it could have killed her, correct?
Correct.
Two, it could have rendered her unconscious,
That is true.
correct, before the stabbing took place, correct?
One possibility.
Or it could have left her semi-conscious, unable to move, correct? All right. I think one of the things you did in the autopsy is you took some fingernail scrapings, is that right?
So the fingernails as part of a homicide investigation are actually clipped and sent off to the crime laboratory.
What's the purpose of that, doctor?
That's to allow for any DNA testing that is to be performed on the fingernails.
So what would you learn from that?
So I'm not a DNA specialist, but that would give you information as to who the individual came in contact with.
All right. And and if it gives you information as to who the individual came in contact with, it gives you information that she came in contact, correct?
Yes,
Yeah. So basically, you would learn whether there was some resistance or scratching or something like that.
Sustained as to this, that question is sustained as to this particular witness, beyond the qualifications on this foundation.
Well, you're trained to do a medical legal death investigation, correct?
correct,
All right. And you have a lot of training.
correct.
You have a medical degree, you have a year or more of postgraduate work in a medical examiner's office, correct?
Correct.
All right. And you understand that the work you do fits into a larger picture of figuring out what happened in these incidents.
Of
that
course,
led to
it's a
people's
team
death.
effort. The medical legal death investigation involves a lot of parties.
Correct. So, is it your understanding that the fingernail scrapings that you take in these homicide cases, that one of the things that may be learned for the purposes of the medical legal death investigation is whether there was some scratching or some Is that your understanding of what you're doing?
I'll sustain the objection. You can ask why during autopsy the scrapings are done from the fingernails. I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. So I think in response to the question why the scrapings are done, that you said for identification purposes, correct?
They are done to be sent to my DNA criminalistic colleagues who then decide what further testing is done on them. That is not my area of expertise.
All right. So you don't, all right. When you were examining the body, at any point did you examine it, did you have a means of examining it to determine whether there was seminal fluid on the body other than the swabs you took for the rape kit?
That is not a part of our investigation.
Right. You don't have access to an alternate light source?
We do not use it routinely at the office, no.
You don't? You
We
have it,
defer
you don't
that
use
to,
it?
again, to the folks who do that kind of investigation
Pardon me?
routine. We defer that to the folks who do the investigation, both on scene and those who do DNA evidence.
All right. But those folks don't have the body to examine, right?
My colleagues on scene would before the body is removed by the medical examiner's office.
Okay. So, about what time of the day did you commence doing the autopsy?
I'll reference my notes for that question. I can look at my diagrams and see. So we begin cases after morning meeting, which is roughly 10 a.m. And it looks like I concluded approximately 3 p.m. is when I finalized these sheets.
Okay. And who was present when you did the autopsy?
I would need to look at the personnel log to know which troopers were there.
Well, there were
So
troopers.
troopers were
present.
there, as well as an autopsy technician. The other board-certified forensic pathologists were also there as well.
And did the troopers or anybody else give you any information about what had been learned about the crime scene or anything like that?
I had been to the crime scene the day before.
All right. And which crime scenes did you visit?
I had access to both the bathroom crime scene as well as the woods.
Okay. Did you have any information from the school video surveillance about the times that people did anything? Did you have any of that information?
Sure.
So did you view the school video surveillance when you visited the scene?
No.
All right. And were you given a list of the times that the victim and the defendant were seen in various places?
I received a Word document printed out that did show times from various cameras.
Okay. So let me ask you, assume, as you found, there's a perforation of the right internal jugular, the left internal jugular,
The left external jugular.
the left external jugular, and the carotid, one carotid artery. Okay? And assume further that these injuries are inflicted sometime between 2:55 and 3:07 p.m. on the day.
A 12-minute interval you're
A
describing?
12-minute interval.
Okay.
Ending at 3:07 p.m. And assume further that the laceration of the vaginal introitus that you observed on autopsy was caused by the insertion of a tree branch in the genital opening, and that happened no earlier than 3:37 p.m., a half hour after the end of the first time period.
Okay.
Do you have an opinion as to whether the victim would be alive or dead when the branch was inserted?
So you're describing a 30-minute interval
A
after
30-minute interval after the
neck injuries are
damage is done to
sustained?
the neck.
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
Okay. So assume the three injuries to the vessels that you noted. The
Yes.
2 jugular injuries and the severance of the carotid. And assume that those injuries were inflicted no later than 3:07 p.m.
Okay.
Somewhere between,
Sure.
in that 12-minute interval before that. Okay? And then further assume that the laceration that you observed, the genital injury, was caused by the insertion of the tree branch that they have in evidence. And that happened at least a half hour later, no earlier than 3:37 p.m. Do you have an opinion as to whether the victim would be alive or dead when that laceration occurred, when the tree branch was inserted?
I have the opinion that the decedent would be incapacitated and certainly not conscious at that juncture after bleeding from those 3 vessels.
But your opinion is that with those 3 arteries severed, at least a half hour earlier, she could still be alive?
Unlikely, but we said the 40-minute time interval earlier as the far edge of possibility, so I'm being consistent with the prior assumption or interpretation.
But maybe I misunderstood you. I thought you said the 40-minute time interval applied to 1 vessel severed, not all 3.
I'd have to refer back to the earlier transcript, but that would make sense as well.
All right. So, I mean, the time interval would be less if you could
Correct.
sever all 3.
Would it be 30 minutes, 10 minutes? I'm not sure.
And this woman sustained other injuries, right? Her esophagus and her trachea are completely severed.
Correct.
But your opinion is she might be alive?
If it was just the severance of those 3 vessels, it's the remote edge of possibility.
The remote
However, as you said, other structures were injured, her windpipe and her esophagus.
Which would presumably hasten her death as well.
Correct.
Correct?
Correct.
And but that still doesn't bring it out of the range of this far out possibility that you're talking about?
I think it certainly puts us in the position where she's more likely dead at that time than alive.
I mean, the strongest inference is that she's dead. Correct?
Hold on. As to the last question, I'll have to see counsel at the side then.
So I'm considering that same set of assumptions, correct? And the other injuries to the neck area, the trachea and the esophagus.
Okay.
Are you able to conclude to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that the victim was still alive?
When the
When
tree
the
branch was
laceration of the-
inserted?
Hold on, wait a minute. Go ahead. Finish the question.
When the laceration of the genital area occurred?
So making the assumption that all the neck injuries happened around the same time, and then 30 minutes later,
At least 30 minutes.
at least 30 minutes later, a tree branch caused a laceration at the vaginal introitus.
Right.
I think it's reasonable to assume that the decedent may have already been dead at that point.
And I think you said that the interpretation of the histological slide is kind of controversial.
Absolutely.
The nature of it. So it'd be fair to say that when you looked at it, you weren't prepared to say that her heart was beating like a normal living person's, correct?
That is correct.
But that one possible explanation of this little hemorrhage that was in there would be that there was some blood pressure left.
That is one interpretation.
Right. And then I think you said on direct, there are other interpretations, right? And one of those interpretations is that the tissue itself could be subject to pressure and manipulation by the stick going in, correct?
That is correct.
And that could force some red blood cells out of those vessels that it tore. Correct?
Absolutely. That's why I classified the injury as perimortem, because I cannot be sure.
I'm going to ask you to, I can approach again, just take a look at it. And we have a stipulation as to what this is.
Sure. Hugo, did you read the stipulation?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have in mind, again, I told you about 4 types of evidence: testimony of witnesses, exhibits, judicial notice, and stipulations. We have a stipulation of fact that the prosecutor will read.
Commonwealth of Reason stipulates, as well as the defense, that this photocopy fairly and accurately depicts the actual slide taken from Ms. Ritzer, specifically the histological slide of the vaginal tissue.
So, have you had a chance to look at that photograph that we just described?
I did.
Can I have it back? I need to ask you to look at it
Sure.
closely. All right. Presumably, you examined this slide under a microscope, right?
Yes.
Okay. And find it here somewhere. So you put the slide into the scope, correct?
Yes.
And the first thing you do maybe is scan the whole thing to get an overview of what it is, correct?
You begin on low power
You
and
begin
go to
on low
higher
power. And then when you locate a point of interest, you increase the power of the scope.
Meaning you look at it at greater magnification to sort of
greater
blow up the image,
magnification.
yes.
And it's in that point of interest that you saw these intact red blood cells that you talked about, correct?
I confirmed them on higher power, yes.
Okay. Looking at that slide, can you tell us where the point of interest was? I know you can't see the blood cells, but can you tell us where the point of interest was?
So in order to locate the intact red blood cells, I'd need to look at it under a microscope. I'm looking at just an image of a slide.
You see on that slide a small little red spot, small little hemorrhage.
So I see an abundance of pink. Again, I would need to look at it under the microscope. I cannot tell from this piece of paper specifically.
I'm going to just move to admit the slide that was simulated for the authenticity.
Admitted.
Exhibit 138.
I just have a moment, Judge.
Sure.
And if I understood your testimony on direct, if the death had occurred before the laceration, before the genital injury, there could still be intact red blood cells there, correct?
Absolutely.
And once the person was dead, there wouldn't be circulation of white cells to start a healing process, correct?
That is true.
So the clock sort of stops with the death.
As far as circulation of red blood cells and white blood cells by the heart, yes.
All right. And certainly, if the death occurred within 30 or 40 minutes earlier, the red cells would still be intact.
Yes, that is a possibility, yep.
Okay, thanks very much.
Ms. McDougall?
Dr. McDonald, when you examined the genital area, you indicated you visualized the laceration, is that correct?
Externally, yes, I did.
Did you see evidence of bleeding from that laceration? On a visual examination, not from the histological examination?
So, if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if I saw red-brown substance in the area?
Correct.
There was abundant leaf debris and dirt, and I was unable to visualize what would presumably be blood. It was obscured.
If death had occurred 30 to 40 minutes before the penetration of the genital opening, would you have expected active bleeding onto the object that penetrated it?
So if the stick had been inserted 30 minutes after the heart stopped beating,
Correct.
there would potentially be blood on the stick as well as if she had still been alive. So I'm unable to make that determination based on autopsy. You cannot tell.
And you couldn't visualize any red-brown stains, but you've indicated there was a fair amount of debris, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, I believe you testified on direct, there was debris all over her body.
Yes.
You were asked some questions about the fingernail scrapings or clippings that you
I do
took.
clippings, yes.
Did you have an opportunity to make observations with your naked eye of the condition of her hands and fingernails?
So her hands in general, they had bags over them, which I removed. And on her hands, both her right and left hand, they had this organic debris we're talking about. They had abundant leaves, pine needles, dirt, mostly dirt, and there was reddish-brown substance on both of her hands as well.
And what was the condition? Did you notice anything else caught in her hands or her fingernails?
So her fingernails were all well-groomed in short condition. I noted in her left hand, sort of between her fingers, there were 2 long brown hairs that I collected as part of evidence.
And fair to say, you can't say whose hair it was, but the length and color was consistent with her own head hair, is that correct?
It would have been.
And what was the condition of her head hair? I mean, did you notice anything about the debris or other biological in her hair?
Her hair had this abundant organic debris as well, sort of all throughout.
And was there what appeared to be a red-brown substance in her hair as well?
There appeared to be caked red-brown substance, yes.
Okay. In your experience, Dr. McDonald, is it uncommon for deceased victims to have their own hair in their hands?
In the case of homicides, it's not uncommon to see women in particular get a hair caught in their hands.
Now, you were asked, let me ask you about the histological slide that you were just shown. When you create a histological slide, do you do so you can examine it with your naked eye?
No, the purpose is for microscopic examination.
Would you ever, even if that were the actual slide and not a color copy, would you ever make any determinations just from looking the slide itself without a microscope?
No, the purpose is for the microscope. I've already done the examination with my naked eye at autopsy.
Now, if, with respect to the sequence of events, you were asked a number of questions about ABC and then E, F, G, H, I, J. Should probably try and do this just the regular way, but ABC, and then E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P.
Yes.
And those are sort of the two clusters of sharp wounds on either side of injury D.
Yes.
If, and you talked about the effect it would have on the speed of exsanguination if all three of the, or all four, I guess, of the injuries that had significant wound pass were inflicted around the same time. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
If, and you had talked about, I believe on direct, that the carotid artery, which was severed in wound D, would have bled at a higher pressure than the internal or external jugular veins.
Correct.
If the internal and external jugular veins had been severed sometime before, would that affect the degree of pressure at which the carotid, so say she had already been stabbed and injured both the jugulars sometime before and was essentially in the process of dying, would that impact the pressure of the blood in the carotid?
So if you've essentially traumatized or cut through two veins, you've removed blood from the system, so you have sort of a fixed pressure system. And if you remove some of the blood from it, the heart has less blood from which to generate high pressures, so it'd be a lower pressure system if you then broached the carotid, meaning you may get a slower bleeding process if the carotid was injured after the veins.
And to the extent, I'm afraid, I think you may have used the term sort of like you see in the movies, gushing, you wouldn't have had that same effect of cutting the carotid that you would expect if the carotid was cut prior to any other significant injury.
Correct.
And if the carotid was cut while the heart was still beating at healthy beating, would you expect blood to come out of the artery when it was cut? Meaning not just bleed, but actually have some amount of arterial spray.
So the visualization of arterial spray is something you see in the movies, essentially by blood-stained experts on scene. Seeing the arterial spray, you frequently see it on the walls on CSI, is something that demands that nothing is obstructing the wound, so there's no clothing, and the position of the decedent. So if you're standing up, blood exits the carotid differently than if you're laying down, for example. So I only introduce that there's variation in how you see arterial spray based on
Positioning
and clothing, et cetera. So there's a variety of variables.
Okay. And I believe you've said that the potential consequences immediately of the asphyxiation would be she could have died, but she also could have been conscious or semi-conscious.
That is correct.
And semi-conscious or conscious, she would still be potentially lying prone on the ground, either face up or face down.
Yes.
I have nothing further, Doctor.
Mr. Osler, any request?
If she was standing up, she'd have blood on the front of her, correct? When the neck injuries were inflicted.
True. If she's standing up and nothing, again, is obstructing the wound, yes.
And if she was lying face down and bleeding from those injuries, she'd have blood on the front of her.
Dependent on the body or the decedent's position when the injury is inflicted, yes.
And the injuries to her neck are the only injuries that you observed that could produce a volume of blood, correct? She didn't have any other injuries that could have caused a lot of bleeding.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Anything, Ms. McDougall? No. All right, thank you, doctor. Yes, Ms. McDougall? Sure. McDougal, there's another stipulation.
There is, Your Honor, the parties stipulate that Philip Chisholm's date of birth is January 21st of 1999.
Okay. And with that,
The Commonwealth rests.
okay,
I have one matter to publish to the jury.
sure.
Oh,
This is the one I gave you
Yep.
the back.
the back.
Is that marking some of this? Yeah.
Oh, can I just show his honor? One side of action too. Just one side of action.
Oh, he wants to publish it.
That's the one that he wants to publish.
I would just ask the public to.
Yeah, why don't I give a curative instruction before we begin. Sometimes evidence such as a photograph is presented that produces an emotional response in jurors. For example, it's natural and even understandable that you would find sympathy and empathy when you see or hear about a person who has been injured in some serious way or suffered in some way. But as jurors, you've taken an oath under the law, and I have instructed you that the law says that you must separate any emotional reaction on your part from the informational value or weight of the evidence. You are not to be influenced in any way by the unpleasant nature of the photographs. You must find the facts of this case based solely on the evidence. Evidence that a person has suffered harm or a condition that may be difficult to look at or that depicts the alleged victim's medical condition may be relevant for a variety of reasons, including the nature and extent of the alleged victim's injuries. But you can't base facts or your decision on anger, passion, or prejudice or pity for or against either side. Rather, your verdict must be based solely on the evidence and the law as the court instructs you. You can pass that along. And I remind you all, you'll have all the exhibits with you in the jury room when you deliberate. Yeah, let me talk to him. While the exhibit is being published, why don't we just talk about scheduling for one moment before the jury leaves? Ladies and gentlemen, before you leave for the day, I know that some of you are undoubtedly concerned about weather issues, and Wednesday, as far as the view is concerned, we will be going through the school and also through the woods on Wednesday, and I'll talk to you more tomorrow about appropriate way to dress for that. It has to be Wednesday, however. What I want to make sure that you understand, the Commonwealth has rested its case. We'll start the defendant's case tomorrow morning. You've all been serious jurors, conscientious jurors, and I know that you've been working very hard. Keep in mind the instructions of the court every time I give them to you, not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else. Don't do any independent research concerning this case. Avoid any information from any source other than when in the courtroom. Jurors are excused until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All right. Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem within and for this county of Essex at present, depart and give your attendance at this place Tuesday morning next at 9 a.m., to which time and place the sitting of this court is now adjourned. Miss, you will lead off. Juror number 9. And watch your step going up, Julie.
All right, Ms. McDougall and Ms. Regan will address the required finding motion. Do you have a written motion? Yes. Okay.
And Mr. Osler will present this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Osler, I'll hear you on it, please.
So the defendant has moved for a required finding on all counts and offers some argument in two respects. One, the indictment for robbery identifies as the subjects of the robbery the credit cards and the underpants of the victim. And as to the credit cards, I think it's clear on the evidence that the only way he could have gotten them was by going into the classroom afterwards. I said in my memorandum how long it was. I think it was 5 minutes or 8 minutes or something. And that they must have been among her belongings that when he carried out both her school bag and her lunch bag.
Well,
so I would suggest that...
Where is a suggestion in any case, though, because it's clear if the injury takes place first, and then the property is stolen, but it's all part of what's called in the case law from the court one transaction or occurrence, that's no different than if the injury takes place afterwards.
I don't think so. I think it has to be taken from her presence or her protection. And there's certainly some intervening events. He travels here and there to school, and he goes into the classroom. So I would submit that it is not taken from her person or protection, that item on the indictment should be struck.
Okay, we'll take them. I'll hear from you on all the issues, and then I'll hear from Ms. McDougall.
And then the other issue is the one that we discussed before, and that was an issue just now. For the required finding, there needs to be evidence, on all of the evidence considered favorably to the Commonwealth, but on all of it, it needs to be sufficient to commit a rational trier of fact to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt all the elements of the crime. And what's at issue here is whether the victim was even alive when the unnatural rape charge occurred. And I would suggest that although the government's medical examiner has suggested that it was a far-out possibility, she's also said that pretty much the victim pretty much must have been dead upon suffering those injuries. We know from the evidence that there's only one place where there's a lot of blood. Unclear whether the medical examiner is aware of that, but that's in the bathroom. There's very little blood in the barrel, very little. And there's almost none out in the wooded area, including under the body. It's just a very little bit. So I think that the inference is inescapable that she was killed in the bathroom. She didn't suffer any other kinds of injuries that could have produced that kind of bleeding. And she wouldn't have had that much blood left after the neck injuries. So I think the basic principle is that when there's even an equally probable inference that conflicts with the government's inference for the required finding, that defeats proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And the inference that she was dead in the bathroom is a lot more than equally probable.
No,
it's overwhelming.
I can't remember if it was Tarver or Waters, but in one of the cases, I think it was Tarver talking about the continuous transaction or episode. The medical examiner did testify, I believe, that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that the alleged victim was dead. Now, this is different than the situation that's talked about in a lot of these cases where, because we have an issue of a different time in a different place. But I believe that in Massachusetts with the continuing episode, there's a recognition that if the death follows the rape or the rape follows the death and they're in such close proximity that it falls within that Commonwealth versus McCourt continuing episode or transaction. Here, why wouldn't that be the case?
Well, because they're not in such close proximity. Certainly that argument could be made by the government as to the natural rape that's charged, but there's evidence that it took place in the bathroom. And I think the rationale of these cases is that when the two things happen in the same struggle, as it were, so that you really can't tell one or the other, the government doesn't have to prove the order. Even in Tarver, incidentally, Tarver is a felony murder case. Tarver expressly refrains from deciding whether this would do for a rape conviction. In felony murder, as the court knows, that's a much broader scope for sort of bringing people into liability. A point which was re-emphasized in the Hemorrhage case.
No doubt, but rape was the underlying felony for the felony murder.
And in Tarver, yes, and in Tarver, amongst the facts that they cited were that the sexual assault was accompanied by substantial bleeding and the hairs from the inside of the victim's clothing had been forcibly removed from the defendant's pubic area. I mean, a pretty strong indication that the sexual assault and the physical assault all took place at once. It's a case in which there's a violent struggle and the two happen in very close proximity. That's not what's going on here. He leaves that bathroom at 3:07 p.m. The camera catches him with the blood dripping off his hand. He's moving about in the school. He talks to his friend who testified here. He goes and gets the barrel. He's back in the bathroom. Then he's traipsing around outside the school. It's at least a half hour, maybe an hour, before the second incident occurs. He's got to get her out of the barrel and into that area of the woods and position is posed on the ground. So this is not the kind of close proximity that they're talking about in Tarver. It's a little hard to tell. There's so little recitation of facts in the case which actually applies it to the rape charge, the more recent case, Waters. It's a little hard to tell what the criteria are, but even there, you do know from those facts that the two events took place in the same place. They don't tell you anything else, but they're on the same spot, the same piece of ground, or the same apartment, to get which, when the two things happen. This is spatially removed, it's temporally removed, there's intervening events, and certainly the inference that she was dead before she was removed from the bathroom is very strong, and it supports this theory.
Okay, so your argument basically, though, is that there's no logical nexus between the time and place as it relates to the alleged rape in the woods, from which one could find that she was alive, such that the continuing episode or continuing transaction would apply.
Correct.
Okay. Ms. McDougall, let me I understand the evidence about the blood on the stick, the histological slides, and the medical examiner not being able to say unequivocally that Ms. Ritzer was dead at the time. And you can re-argue all those issues, and I'm happy to hear from you. But my question really is, has this continuing transaction, or continuing episode concept ever been used for two separate rapes? And I'm not aware that it has.
It has, because I don't think it usually carries any weight.
Well, okay. So what I've looked at cases from a lot of jurisdictions, not just Massachusetts, and I'll hear your arguments on whether or not there's a possibility that Ms. Ritzer was alive at the time, and whether or not under Lattimore there's enough to allow that a natural aggravated rape to go to the jury, and the felony murder for rape on what occurred in the woods to go to the jury. But I'm having a sort of preliminary issue, which is any application of the continuing transaction or continuing event to apply to two different rapes in two different locations. And I didn't find any cases.
I'm not aware of any cases, Your Honor, but I think what's significant in terms of a continuing transaction is that there is a reasonable inference that the defendant may have been interrupted in the rape in the bathroom by Danielle Bedard, so that he clearly had ejaculated to some extent, but I would note there were only 2 sperm cells noted by Ms. Scott. He had not, the Commonwealth would suggest, had the ability to complete what he sought to do to Ms. Ritzer, and I would suggest that that is what links, in part, the 2 sexual assaults, that he was less looking to dispose her body than looking for a place to finish what he had started. And I would point to the fact that she isn't just raped in the woods. She's posed, she's displayed for those who ultimately find her, not just with the branch, but by the way her clothing is positioned and why the legs are positioned. I would respectfully take issue with the presumption that she was clearly dead in the bathroom. The only evidence of that comes from Mr. Pimentel, and I would suggest that his description of the bathroom has to be weighed against a couple of things. One is his demeanor in discussing the bathroom, both then with Mr. Marshall as well as on the stand, as well as the fact that Ms. Bedard does not see any blood. Certainly more blood may have collected during the time she was in the bathroom, but this isn't a case where there was enough blood that Ms. Bedard even noticed it during the brief time she was in the bathroom. I would suggest that there is circumstantial evidence that would suggest that it's not, that not all of the cutting that was ultimately done was done in that bathroom. He spends far more time in those woods than he does in that bathroom. It is only 23 minutes from the time he leaves the bathroom after the initial assault until he is last seen entering the woods. So it's only a 23-minute break during which he is continuously in movement, the Commonwealth would suggest with purpose, to get her stuff and his stuff out of the classroom. He's heading back towards the bathroom. He's interrupted by Mr. Escarcia. He ultimately goes right then and gets the barrel and brings the barrel right up to the bathroom after initially, I would say, disposing of some clothing from Ms. Quigley. So I would suggest that it is a continuous transaction. The Commonwealth's suggestion is that this was a sexually motivated homicide and that he didn't get a chance to finish the sexual assault in the bathroom, and he did something else in the woods where he spent far more time, I believe a total of 42 minutes if you count both of the trips he takes into the woods, when all else he had to do was cover her in leaves, which were abundant, was dump the recycling barrel and other items haphazardly, throwing them down the things, and bury the shoes. And yet he spends 42 minutes in those woods. So the Commonwealth would suggest that this was a sexually motivated crime and that he didn't get to finish what he started in the bathroom, and he finished it in the woods.
So, assuming without commenting on the burden of persuasion in this regard, but assuming that those inferences are reasonable, there's one case from another state that talks about how if the victim was dead, how appalling and disgusting it is, and that it constitutes certain crimes, but not the crime of rape. And and certainly what the Commonwealth alleges happened in the woods is relevant on a multiplicity of issues, including the intent in the bathroom. But the fact that, to use the Commonwealth words, he hadn't finished the sexual assault yet does not necessarily answer the question about the continuing transaction, because at the core of the two Massachusetts cases that we have is the possibility that in those cases that the victim was alive. And so how long it took and whether or not he had finished the sexual assault is not dispositive. So I think we need to look at whether or not
Well, the reason I didn't touch on that issue is because the court had just noted that it was familiar with the evidence. As the Commonwealth position is, there is a strong possibility she was alive, particularly if all of the neck wounds were not inflicted in that bathroom. That in fact, what got Dr. McDonald to come down to her time frame was the assumption made by Mr. Osler in his questions, rightfully so, that all of those neck wounds were inflicted at the same time. And I would respectfully suggest that there is evidence to the contrary, that while there may be a lot of blood in the bathroom, there's very little blood on the defendant when he exits the bathroom after only 11 minutes, during which he had to ambush her, asphyxiate her, do some amount of cutting, and rape her in 11 minutes, and then he only has blood on one hand. As disturbing as that hand is, it's not a lot of blood. It's only when he emerges from the woods that he is covered in blood, all down the front of his pants, which is Colleen Ritzer's blood. That he's no longer wearing his socks, which are found saturated with red-brown stains in the woods. So the Commonwealth would, there's not blood visible at all on his sneakers when he is in the school. It is only when his sneakers are recovered from the woods that one of them is saturated with blood. So I would suggest respectfully there is circumstantial evidence to suggest there was significant cutting that happened in those woods.
all right. The court will deny the required finding as to the armed robbery and rule tomorrow morning on the rape in the woods. I'm going to review the cases from other jurisdictions as it relates to continuing transaction.
In the event that the court directs the Commonwealth out as to the rape as a standalone charge, we would still be asking that the felony murder go to the jury on an attempted aggravated rape, and I would point to Commonwealth versus Jeans.
Okay.
I would just emphasize that the felony murder criteria is different than the criteria for liability of rape, even though rape is substantial because of the attempt, for one thing, it accompanies attempts, and for another thing, there's a second rape charge in the case.
All right. Well, if I'm inclined to direct out the rape in the woods, we'll address the issue of the availability for felony murder, and if not, then that'll be a moot issue. All right. So, are there any issues relative to the witnesses, as long as we have a couple of minutes here tomorrow morning, that are significant evidentiary issues?
Your Honor, I need to remind myself of the lineup. The only issues I see are, I know there were some photographs that Ms. Regan had provided me of the defendant as a child. I didn't know if she intended to introduce those tomorrow. I would want to be heard on that. I believe there are also some records of the defendant's grandmother and aunt, which Ms. Oker intends to introduce through the grandfather. I'm not objecting to their admissibility, but I may want to be heard on the extent of them. I believe there's a case that talks about it becoming duplicative, and we are talking about a lot of records going back several decades, and I may want to be heard on limiting those, although I don't know that that would need to happen in real time. That may be something we could address later, because I'm not objecting to their admissibility, I'm just objecting to the volume.
All right, and I think the point of the volume and the case you're referencing deals with the basis for the opinion. So the basis for the opinion, as it relates to family history, I assume is the purpose for the records, Ms. Oker. All right. All right. Court will be in recess then until tomorrow morning.
All rise.